This story is titled, My Parents Convinced Everyone I Quit Military Service Early while I stayed quiet at my Golden Brothers graduation ceremony, until the commander spotted me and announced, Major, what brings you here? Everyone went silent. My mother nearly fainted. Hey everyone, my name is Victoria Cross, and I'm 33 years old. Today I found myself standing at the back of my brother's Marine Force recon ceremony, wearing civilian clothes like any other family member in attendance. To everyone around me, I appeared completely invisible, just another unremarkable relative there to support their loved one. My own family had long since written me off as the military dropout, the one who couldn't cut it, the disappointment who had squandered every opportunity given to her. The irony of the situation hit me like a physical blow as I watched the ceremony unfold. While my family saw me as someone who had failed spectacularly at military service, the truth was almost laughably different. I am actually a colonel in the Air Force Special Operations Command, one of the youngest people to ever achieve this rank in my division. For over a decade, I had maintained this carefully constructed cover story for national security reasons, allowing my family to believe I was nothing more than a corporate drone pushing papers at some forgettable marketing company. As I scanned the crowd of proud families and distinguished military personnel, my trained eyes automatically cataloged security positions and potential threats, habits so deeply ingrained that I couldn't turn them off even in civilian clothes. That's when I noticed him. My brother Tyler's commanding general, a man I recognized immediately from classified briefings and joint operations. Admiral Wilson was scanning the audience, and suddenly his eyes locked onto mine. I watched his expression change from casual observation to dawning recognition, his eyes widening as he processed the impossible sight before him. What happened next would change everything between my family and me forever. But before I tell you about that moment that shattered years of carefully maintained deception, let me explain how I ended up living this double life in the first place. Growing up in Miami as the daughter of retired Marine Colonel Robert Cross meant that military excellence wasn't just encouraged in our household. It was an absolute expectation. Our home looked like a shrine to Marine Corps history, with memorabilia covering every available wall space. Challenge coins, commendation plaques, unit photographs, and ceremonial swords created a museum-like atmosphere that reminded us daily of the legacy we were expected to uphold. Our dinner conversations never strayed far from military topics. Every evening meal became an informal briefing on strategy, tactics, and combat history. My father's commanding voice would fill our dining room as he regaled us with tales from his various deployments, his eyes gleaming with the particular pride that comes from a life of distinguished service. These weren't just stories to him. They were lessons, examples of the kind of excellence he expected from his children. My younger brother Tyler absorbed every single word with the devotion of a true believer. He hung on our father's every syllable, asking detailed questions about equipment, tactics, and command decisions. Tyler seemed born for this life, naturally gravitating toward everything military with an enthusiasm that made our parents beam with satisfaction. I listened just as intently, equally fascinated by the stories and equally hungry to prove myself worthy of the Cross family legacy. The tales of leadership under pressure, of split-second decisions that saved lives, of the honor that came with serving something greater than yourself. All of it called to something deep inside me. But somehow, no matter how much interest I showed or how many questions I asked, my enthusiasm was never received the same way Tyler's was. Victoria has a sharp mind, my father would tell his Marine buddies when they visited, his tone carrying a particular weight that I learned to dread. But she lacks the discipline for real service. This assessment stung like hell every single time I heard it, particularly because I had spent my entire childhood dreaming of nothing more than following directly in his footsteps. The criticism was especially painful because I knew it wasn't based on lack of effort. I ran every morning before school without fail, pushing myself through Miami's oppressive humidity while most of my classmates were still sleeping. I spent hours studying military tactics from the books on my father's shelves, memorizing everything from Sun Tzu to modern counterinsurgency doctrine. When it came time for college applications, I applied to the Coast Guard Academy with perfect grades and test scores that placed me in the top percentile nationally. When my acceptance letter arrived, it was honestly the proudest day of my young life. For once, I had achieved something that met my father's exacting standards. He actually hugged me that day, something rare enough to make the moment feel absolutely monumental in our family dynamic. "Don't waste this opportunity," he said. his voice gruff with what I desperately hoped was genuine emotion rather than mere expectation. "This is your chance to prove yourself." The Coast Guard Academy turned out to be everything I had hoped for, and more. It was challenging and fulfilling in ways I had never imagined possible, pushing me both physically and mentally in directions that revealed capabilities I didn't even know I possessed. The rigorous academic curriculum combined with intensive physical training created an environment where excellence wasn't just expected. It was the bare minimum for survival. I found myself excelling in strategy courses, where my ability to see patterns and analyze complex scenarios set me apart from my classmates. The physical training that had seemed daunting from the outside became a source of genuine enjoyment. Each challenge conquered, building both my confidence and my capabilities. By the end of my time there, I was graduating in the top percentile for both academics and physical fitness, an achievement that should have made my father burst with pride. But what my family never knew, what they couldn't have possibly imagined, was the real plot twist that would define the rest of my life. During my third year at the academy, I was quietly approached by intelligence officers who had been observing my performance with keen interest. They had noticed my particular aptitude in several key areas that caught their attention. Pattern recognition that bordered on intuitive crisis analysis performed under extreme pressure, and tactical thinking that seemed to operate on a different level than my peers. These officers offered me something that would change everything, a position in a highly classified program that operated at the intersection of intelligence gathering and special operations. The opportunity was extraordinary, representing the kind of challenging, meaningful work I had dreamed of since childhood. But it came with a price that I never could have anticipated. The program demanded that I make an immediate transition, leaving behind everything I had built at the academy. More critically, it required absolute secrecy about my new path. The officers explained that operational security wasn't just a guideline. It was a matter of life and death, both for me and for the assets I would be working with in the field. They suggested what seemed like the simplest possible explanation for my sudden departure, that I had washed out of the academy completely. It would be believable enough, they reasoned, since many talented candidates don't make it through the rigorous program for various reasons. This cover story would draw minimal attention from family and friends, allowing me to disappear into my new role without raising uncomfortable questions. I agreed to the deception, believing with the naive optimism of youth that my family would eventually learn the truth. I convinced myself that when my assignment reached a certain security level, disclosure would become possible, and I could finally share the reality of what I was actually accomplishing. I couldn't have been more wrong about that assumption. My first visit home after the supposed dropout was a nightmare that set the tone for everything that would follow. The moment I walked through the door, I could feel the weight of my family's disappointment pressing down on me like a physical force. My mother, Catherine, greeted me with tight lips and eyes that couldn't quite meet mine, her body language communicating everything she couldn't bring herself to say directly. "I just don't understand how you could throw it all away," she finally said, her voice heavy with a disappointment that cut straight through me. "Your father pulled strings to get you considered for that academy. He called in favors, put his reputation on the line. The accusation hung in the air between us like smoke, poisoning every breath. I didn't ask him to," I replied quietly, the words feeling inadequate even as I spoke them. The classified nature of my new position sealed my lips completely. I couldn't share anything meaningful about what had really happened or where my life was actually heading. Every instinct screamed at me to defend myself, to explain that I hadn't thrown anything away, that I was actually embarking on something extraordinary. But operational security demands silence, and I had already committed to that path. My father's reaction was somehow even worse than my mother's open disappointment. I had expected him to rage, to lecture me with the commanding voice that had shaped my childhood. Instead, he simply stopped talking about me entirely. It was as if I had been erased from his mental roster of children, deleted from the family narrative he shared with others. When relatives asked about his children, his face would light up as he discussed Tyler's accomplishments at the academy, where my brother was following the traditional path I had supposedly abandoned. Tyler was everything our father had hoped for in a military child. Disciplined, focused, clearly destined for the kind of career that would make the Cross name proud. Then, when my name inevitably came up in conversation, my father would simply change the subject, his silence more devastating than any criticism could have been. Easter dinners became exercises in pure psychological endurance. The family would gather around the table, and my father would stand at the head like the commanding officer he had always been, raising his glass and toasts that celebrated everyone except me. "Tyler's been selected for advanced tactical training," he would announce while slicing the ham with military precision, his movements as controlled and deliberate as everything else in his life. "Top of his class, we're so proud," my mother would add, her hand resting protectively on Tyler's shoulder while her eyes deliberately slid past me as if I weren't even sitting at the same table. "It's comforting when your children find their purpose," she would continue, the implication hanging heavy in the air. My cousin Jessica, who had always possessed a talent for tactless observations, once asked directly across the table, "So Vic, are you still working that administrative job at the marketing company?" This was the cover story I had maintained religiously, a boring corporate position designed specifically to discourage further questions and fade into the background of family conversations. "Yes," I answered, swallowing both the lie and what remained of my pride. "Still there, good benefits, I guess," she replied, with a thin smile that conveyed volumes about her assessment of my life choices and my apparent lack of ambition. Meanwhile, my actual career was advancing at an extraordinary pace that would have shocked them all. I couldn't tell them about the night operations in countries that were officially untouched by American forces. I couldn't mention the intelligence I had gathered that had directly saved countless lives, or explain the commendations that were accumulating in a secure facility rather than displayed on my bedroom wall like Tyler's growing collection of awards. I couldn't explain the months of complete silence when I was unreachable because I was operating deep undercover in hostile territory, gathering intelligence that would later inform critical national security decisions. Each success in my classified world seemed to create a parallel disappointment in my family's eyes, as if the universe was maintaining some cruel balance between my professional achievements and personal failures. When I was promoted to major, my parents were busy discussing how Tyler had been selected for an elite training program that would fast-track his career in the Marines. The timing felt like cosmic irony. Here I was achieving significant recognition in one of the most competitive military environments in the world, while my family celebrated what they saw as Tyler's superior dedication and natural talent. When I received a Silver Star in a private ceremony attended only by cleared personnel, my mother was simultaneously lamenting to her friends about her daughter, who just didn't apply herself to anything meaningful. The medal sits in a secure facility somewhere, its existence known only to a handful of people with the appropriate clearance levels, while Tyler's awards create an impressive display in our parents' living room that visitors can admire and discuss freely. Tyler himself wasn't deliberately unkind or intentionally cruel during this period. He simply followed our parents' lead, growing increasingly distant as our supposedly divergent life paths created what seemed like an unbridgeable gap between us. Occasionally, he would call with news of his latest accomplishments, always ending these conversations with an awkward, "So how's the office job?" That made my stomach clench with the weight of deception. I would murmur the appropriate congratulations, genuinely proud of his achievements while simultaneously offering vague updates about my fictional corporate life. Every word felt like swallowing glass, but I had committed to this path and understood that operational security wasn't negotiable, regardless of the personal cost. Years passed this way, with the divide between my public failure and private success growing wider with each promotion, each successful mission, each moment of recognition that I couldn't share with the people who had once mattered most to me. I developed what I thought was a thick skin about my family's perception, focusing instead on my missions and the tangible difference I was making in the world. But deep down, the pain of being seen as the family disappointment never fully subsided or disappeared entirely. Every achievement in my secret life was shadowed by the knowledge that the people who should have been proudest of me didn't even know what I was actually doing with my life. The contrast between my professional success and personal isolation created a unique kind of psychological pressure that no training had prepared me to handle. The irony was particularly sharp during family gatherings when military topics came up in conversation. I would sit silently while my father and uncles analyzed operations that had made national news, operations that I had sometimes helped coordinate from the intelligence side. Their confident assessments were often completely wrong, based on the limited information released to the public, but I could only nod and listen while swallowing corrections that could never be spoken. My transition from Coast Guard Academy student to Air Force Special Operations was both abrupt and incredibly intense. While my family believed I was licking my wounds and settling for civilian mediocrity after my supposed academic failure, I was actually undergoing some of the most rigorous training the military has to offer. The disconnect between their perception and my reality couldn't have been more complete. The program that had recruited me specialized in intelligence gathering and analysis with direct tactical applications, a rare combination that suited my particular skill set perfectly. This wasn't just desk work or theoretical analysis. It required the ability to process and act on critical information while operating in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. The training facility was located in an unmarked compound somewhere in Nevada, a place that didn't officially exist on any maps or government documents. Our days began at 4 a.m. and often didn't end until well after midnight. Physical conditioning was merely the foundation of what we were learning. The real work involved developing the mental capabilities to process and analyze intelligence in real-time crisis situations, often while experiencing extreme physical stress or severe sleep deprivation. Cross, your mind works differently, my instructor Major Lawrence noted, after I had solved a particularly complex intelligence simulation that had stumped most of my fellow trainees. You see patterns where others see chaos. That's exactly what we need in the field. This natural aptitude for pattern recognition under pressure accelerated my progress through the program significantly. While most trainees required a full 18 months to complete the intensive course, I managed to finish in just 11 months. The accelerated timeline wasn't just about academic achievement. It reflected my ability to synthesize complex information quickly and make sound tactical decisions under the kind of pressure that breaks most people. My first assignment came immediately after graduation, with no time for celebration or adjustment. I was deployed on a low-profile intelligence-gathering operation in Eastern Europe, where Russian influence was creating concerning ripple effects that threatened regional stability. The mission required me to operate essentially alone, gathering critical information while maintaining complete cover in a hostile environment. It was during this period that Colonel Diana Patterson became my mentor, a pioneering woman in special operations who recognized something in me that reminded her of her own early career. Colonel Patterson had broken barriers and overcome obstacles that most people couldn't even imagine, and she took me under her wing with a protective intensity that probably saved my career. "The system isn't built for us," she told me frankly during a debriefing after a particularly challenging operation. "But that's precisely why we succeed in it. We approach problems from angles others don't consider, and we have to be twice as good to get half the recognition." Under her guidance, I learned to navigate not just the operational challenges of intelligence work, but also the unique difficulties of being a woman in this elite space. She taught me to use others' underestimation as a tactical advantage, to speak with quiet authority rather than trying to match the volume of my male colleagues, and to build networks of trust that transcended the usual military hierarchies that often excluded women. By my 4th year in the program, I had been promoted twice and was leading my own intelligence team in operations spanning 3 continents. My specialty became extracting critical information in environments where traditional intelligence assets couldn't operate safely. Situations that required a combination of technical skill, psychological insight, and physical capability that few people possessed. One particular mission in Syria resulted in intelligence that prevented a major terrorist attack on European soil. The operation required me to infiltrate a network that had been planning coordinated strikes across multiple cities, gathering evidence and identifying key players while maintaining deep cover for weeks. The classified commendation I received afterward cited my exceptional judgment under extreme pressure and innovative tactical approach to an unprecedented situation. Yet each time I received recognition within my classified world, the contrast with my family life became increasingly painful and isolating. I attended award ceremonies completely alone, watching other officers embrace their proud families afterward while I slipped away quietly to maintain my cover. The celebrations that should have been shared moments of triumph became stark reminders of the personal cost of my chosen path. I celebrated promotions with colleagues who knew only pieces of my story, never the full picture of who I really was or where I had come from. The compartmentalized nature of intelligence work meant that even my closest professional relationships were built on partial truths and carefully managed information sharing. Meanwhile, I continued to maintain my cover as an unremarkable corporate drone during increasingly infrequent family visits. The cognitive dissonance of switching between these two identities became more challenging with each passing year, requiring a level of psychological compartmentalization that sometimes felt unsustainable. "Congratulations on your promotion to team lead in customer service," my mother said during one phone call, clearly making an effort to show interest in what she believed was my uninspiring career trajectory. The genuine enthusiasm in her voice for what she thought was a minor corporate advancement made the deception even more painful. I had just been promoted to lieutenant colonel after a successful counterterrorism operation in Somalia that had required months of preparation and coordination with international partners. The promotion placed me among the youngest officers to achieve that rank in special operations, representing recognition for work that had directly saved hundreds of lives. "Thanks, Mom," I replied, hating every syllable of the deception but unable to break character. "It's just a small step up, nothing too exciting." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, reducing one of the most significant achievements of my career to corporate banality. The operational security requirements of my position meant maintaining absolute secrecy, even as I rose to command larger teams and more sensitive missions than ever before. My cover story remained firmly in place, known only to a handful of high-ranking officers who understood the complete scope of my service record. Most people who worked with me knew only the portions of my background that were relevant to our specific joint operations, creating a fragmented professional identity that matched my fractured personal life. By the time I reached the rank of colonel at age 32, I had achieved something truly extraordinary. This accomplishment placed me among the youngest officers to achieve this rank in the history of special operations, a distinction that reflected not just personal capability, but years of exceptional performance under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. During my rise through the ranks, I had led operations in over a dozen countries, each mission adding layers of experience and expertise that few people in the world possessed. My work had directly saved countless lives through intelligence gathering that prevented terrorist attacks, disrupted hostile operations, and protected American interests in volatile regions across the globe. My specialty in counterterrorism had naturally expanded to include disrupting human trafficking networks that operated across international borders and preventing hostile cyber operations against critical infrastructure that could have crippled entire cities. The scope of responsibility that came with each promotion was staggering, involving decisions that affected not just individual lives, but national security on a global scale. What made my rapid rise even more remarkable was achieving it while facing the additional challenges that women in special operations encounter on a daily basis. I had to navigate skepticism from some traditional military circles who questioned whether women belonged in elite combat roles, adapt to equipment and tactical approaches that were originally designed for male physiology, and develop leadership styles that commanded respect in environments where female leaders were still relatively rare. Through it all, I carried the strange and increasingly heavy burden of my family's disappointment. Each time I returned from a classified deployment to attend a holiday gathering or family event, I had to step back into the role of Vic the underachiever, switching from commanding elite military units to playing the part of the family's greatest disappointment. I became increasingly adept at deflecting questions about my work with vague corporate jargon, redirecting conversations to Tyler's genuinely impressive Marine career, and maintaining the fiction that my life was unremarkable and unfulfilling. The mental gymnastics required to maintain these dual identities grew more exhausting with each passing year. There were moments when the deception felt absolutely unbearable, like when my father made passing comments about people who couldn't cut it in real service, or when distant relatives asked patronizing questions about when I might finally find some direction in my life. The irony was so complete, it sometimes felt like living in a surreal alternate reality. But my commitment to national security and the critical missions I was leading always silenced the impulse to reveal the truth. The work was simply too important, the stakes too high, and the potential consequences of exposure too dangerous. If maintaining my family's disappointment was the price for operational security and the safety of the people I was sworn to protect, I would continue to pay it regardless of the personal cost. Last Easter marked a particular low point in my relationship with my family, a dinner that crystallized just how wide the gap between perception and reality had become. I had just returned from coordinating a joint intelligence operation with NATO forces, 36 sleepless hours of tension and coordination that ultimately prevented a significant security breach that could have destabilized an entire region. Instead of getting recovery time, I went straight to my parents' house, exchanging my tactical gear for civilian clothes and trading the hypervigilance of command for the different but equally intense tension of family dinner. The psychological whiplash of these transitions was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. My father stood at the head of the table with his crystal glass raised in a toast, his voice carrying the colonel's authority that had never quite left him even in retirement. "To Tyler," he announced with unmistakable pride, "whose selection for the Elite Force Recon Training Program continues our family's tradition of excellence in service." Everyone around the table raised their glasses immediately, my mother beaming with tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "We couldn't be prouder," she added, her voice thick with emotion as she gazed at Tyler with the kind of maternal pride that I hadn't seen directed toward me in over a decade. I joined the toast sincerely, despite everything that had transpired between us. Tyler's accomplishment was genuinely significant, and regardless of our strained relationship, I respected his dedication and hard work. Force Recon represents the elite of Marine Special Operations, and earning selection required the kind of commitment and capability that deserved recognition. But as glasses clinked and congratulations flowed around the table, my mother leaned toward her sister and whispered something that was clearly intended for my ears. "At least one of our children is making us proud," she said, just loudly enough for me to hear every devastating word. The comment sliced through me despite the thick skin I thought I had developed over years of similar remarks. I excused myself to the kitchen, ostensibly to help with dessert preparation, but really to compose myself and regain the control that years of military training had taught me to maintain under pressure. My cousin Jessica followed me into the kitchen, cornering me by the refrigerator with the predatory instinct of someone who sensed vulnerability. "So still pushing papers at that marketing company?" she asked, sipping her wine with an air of superiority that made my jaw clench. Jessica had recently been promoted at her law firm and never missed an opportunity to highlight what she perceived as the contrast in our career trajectories. Her success was real and earned, but she wielded it like a weapon against anyone she considered beneath her station. "Something like that," I replied carefully, focusing on arranging pie slices rather than meeting her gaze. The simple task gave me something to do with my hands, while I fought the urge to explain exactly what kind of paper pushing I actually did. "You know my firm has an opening in our administrative department," she offered with faux generosity dripping from every word. "It probably pays better than what you're making now. I could put in a word if you're interested in finally moving up in the world." I thanked her politely while imagining how she might react if she knew that I had briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff just the previous week, or that my security clearance was higher than most senators. The mental image of her expression provided a moment of dark humor in an otherwise painful conversation. The dinner conversation eventually shifted to a recent military operation that had made national news, an operation that I'd actually helped coordinate from the intelligence side. I sat silently as my father and uncle analyzed what little information had been released to the public, both of them confidently incorrect about how the mission had actually unfolded. "If they'd approached from the eastern perimeter instead," my father declared with the authority of his decades of experience, "they could have avoided that initial resistance entirely." I took a long sip of water, knowing that the eastern perimeter had been deliberately avoided due to intelligence I had personally verified about hidden surveillance systems that would have compromised the entire operation. The urge to correct him burned in my throat, but I swallowed it along with my water, maintaining the silence that operational security demanded. After dinner, Tyler announced his engagement to his girlfriend Allison, a naval medical officer he had met during his training. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for what should have been a joyous family celebration. The family erupted in immediate celebration, with champagne appearing from nowhere as if my mother had been keeping it ready for exactly this moment. Toasts multiplied around the room, and my mother immediately began discussing wedding plans with the kind of enthusiastic energy that only comes from genuine happiness. The joy in the room was infectious and real, transforming the dinner from a formal family obligation into something that felt genuinely warm and celebratory. In the midst of this joyful chaos, my secure phone vibrated with the distinctive pattern that indicated the highest priority communication possible. The timing was absolutely terrible, but the pattern meant only one thing: immediate deployment orders for a situation that required my specific expertise. I slipped away to the guest bedroom to check the message, my heart sinking as I read the details. A situation had developed overnight that required my immediate attention, with extraction scheduled in just 3 hours. The urgency meant that whatever was happening was critical enough to pull me away from personal time, something that rarely occurred unless lives were directly at stake. I returned to the celebration and pulled Tyler aside to offer my genuine congratulations before I had to leave. His face was flushed with happiness and champagne, making what I had to tell him even more difficult. "Tyler, I'm so happy for you and Allison," I said, meaning every word. "This is wonderful news and she's perfect for you." Then I had to deliver the news that would reinforce every negative assumption my family had about my priorities. "I'm sorry, but I have to leave immediately. There's a work emergency that can't wait." His face fell in disappointment tinged with the familiar judgment I had grown accustomed to over the years. Seriously, Vic? It's my engagement celebration. What kind of marketing emergency happens on Easter night that can't wait until tomorrow? The question was completely reasonable from his perspective, and I had no way to explain that the marketing emergency was actually a developing international crisis that could affect global security. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it completely, but unable to explain further. I wouldn't leave if it wasn't absolutely necessary. My parents reacted with the resigned disappointment that had become their default response to my seemingly selfish behavior. Of course Victoria has to leave, my mother said to the relatives, not bothering to lower her voice enough to pretend I couldn't hear. Her priorities have always been different from the rest of the family. I caught my father's subtle headshake as I gathered my coat, the gesture of disapproval that had followed me since childhood like a shadow. It was the same expression he had worn when I was 12 and chose to study instead of attending a family barbecue, or when I was 16 and missed Christmas morning because I was volunteering at a homeless shelter. As I drove away from the house, the family continued celebrating without me, their laughter and joy growing distant in my rearview mirror, while I prepared mentally for the classified operation ahead. The mission kept me deployed through Christmas and into the new year, requiring months of deep cover work that made communication with my family impossible. When I finally returned to regular contact, I learned that my absence had become a focal point of family discussion in ways that made the original disappointment seem mild. Tyler's engagement party had been held without me, and my failure to attend had been interpreted as further evidence of my complete disregard for family obligations and relationships. "Your brother was hurt," my mother informed me during a tense phone call that felt more like a formal reprimand than a family conversation. "After everything he's accomplished, the least you could do is show up for his important moments. It's not like you have anything more important going on." What she couldn't know, what none of them could know, was that during his engagement party, I had been leading a critical intelligence operation that resulted in the rescue of kidnapped aid workers in a hostile region. The mission earned me another commendation, one that would remain in a classified file rather than displayed on any mantle where family could see and acknowledge it. The growing divide between my professional success and personal failure had created an increasingly unbearable tension in my life. Each family interaction became more strained and uncomfortable, with every deception feeling more painful as the gap between reality and perception continued to widen. The psychological cost of maintaining these dual identities was reaching a point that felt genuinely unsustainable. As Tyler's Force Recon ceremony approached, I found myself at what felt like a breaking point. I was torn between my sworn duty to national security and operational requirements and my crumbling relationship with my family. The people who should have been closest to me had become strangers, and I had become a stranger to them, all in service of a greater good they couldn't even know existed. The day of Tyler's Force Recon ceremony dawned clear and bright, with that perfect South Florida weather that seemed to mock my inner turmoil. I had deliberated for weeks about whether to attend, knowing that my presence would be scrutinized by a family that had grown increasingly frustrated with what they perceived as my indifference to Tyler's achievements. My decision to go wasn't simple or straightforward. I had to request a rare day of leave from my current duties, arrange secure transportation that wouldn't compromise my position, and carefully select civilian clothes that would allow me to blend in while still maintaining the appropriate military bearing that had become too ingrained to break, even in this context. The Marine Special Operations Command facility gleamed in the morning sun as I approached, and I found myself instinctively cataloging security positions and protocols with my trained eyes. I noticed details that most civilians would miss completely: the positioning of security personnel, the sightlines from elevated positions, the flow patterns designed to control crowd movement. This automatic awareness reminded me of just how far I had traveled from the person my family believed me to be. I arrived deliberately late, slipping into the back row as families claimed the more prominent seats near the front of the ceremony area. My parents occupied positions of honor in the family section, my father wearing his dress uniform with the unmistakable pride of a Marine colonel whose son was following in his distinguished footsteps. My mother sat beside him, elegant in a navy blue dress, her posture reflecting the military precision she had absorbed through decades of marriage to a career Marine officer. Everything about their presence communicated the satisfaction of parents whose expectations had been met and exceeded. The ceremony proceeded with the characteristic discipline and tradition of Marine special warfare that I recognized from my own classified ceremonies. Each element, from the presentation of colors to the precise movements of the honor guard, followed protocols I knew intimately from years of similar events in my own career. The difference was that today's event was public, celebrated openly with proud families and commemorative programs, unlike the clandestine recognition that marked my own achievements. As the ceremony progressed, I found myself analyzing the security perimeter out of professional habit while simultaneously absorbing the genuine significance of Tyler's accomplishment. Becoming a Force Recon Marine represented years of grueling training and exceptional dedication, a fact I appreciated perhaps more fully than anyone else in my family could. The selection process was extraordinarily demanding, and Tyler had earned this recognition through genuine merit and determination. Midway through the ceremony, I noticed a familiar face on the platform that made my blood run cold. Rear Admiral Wilson, who had commanded joint operations where my intelligence team had provided critical support, was scheduled to deliver remarks as part of the leadership cadre. Seeing him triggered an immediate internal alert system that years of covert operations had developed. Admiral Wilson was one of the few high-ranking officers who knew my complete service record and true rank, making his presence at this ceremony extremely problematic for maintaining my cover. I shifted slightly in my seat, angling myself to become less visible from the stage, using the subtle positioning techniques that intelligence officers learn to avoid recognition when operating in potentially compromising situations. The movement was calculated and precise, the kind of adjustment that becomes second nature after years of avoiding detection in hostile environments. For a moment, I believed I had successfully minimized my presence and could observe the ceremony without incident. Then came Tyler's moment of recognition. He stood tall and proud as his accomplishments were read aloud to the assembled crowd, his face composed in the disciplined expression of a warrior receiving honors. Despite our complicated relationship and the years of distance that had grown between us, pride swelled in my chest as I watched him accept this recognition. Whatever else had transpired between us over the years, my brother had earned this moment through genuine merit and determination. The Force Recon selection represented the culmination of years of dedicated service and exceptional performance under pressure. As applause followed Tyler's recognition, I allowed myself to relax marginally, which turned out to be a critical mistake in retrospect. My slight movement and momentary drop in vigilance caught Admiral Wilson's eye during his routine scan of the audience, the kind of systematic observation that high-ranking military officers perform automatically. I watched his expression change in real time as recognition dawned. First confusion, as he tried to process why someone who looked familiar was sitting in civilian clothes at a Marine ceremony. Then certainty, as his memory connected my face with the classified briefings and joint operations we had shared. Finally, an unmistakable reaction to finding a highly decorated Air Force Special Operations colonel sitting anonymously in the family section of a public ceremony. Our eyes locked momentarily across the distance between the platform and my seat. In that brief exchange, I conveyed a silent request for discretion that military personnel of our rank and experience understand implicitly. The look carried years of training in operational security and the mutual understanding that some things require careful handling. The Admiral gave an almost imperceptible nod, and I believed for a moment that the incident had passed without further complications. I began mentally calculating my exit strategy, planning to congratulate Tyler briefly before departing to avoid any extended family interaction that might create additional opportunities for exposure. But as the formal portion of the ceremony concluded and families began moving toward their graduating Marines, I noticed Admiral Wilson conversing with another officer while gesturing subtly in my direction. My internal alarm system sharpened immediately as I recognized the second officer. Commander Brooks had also worked with my team during a joint counterterrorism operation the previous year, making him another person who knew far more about my real position than was safe for my cover story. Now both men were looking in my direction with the particular expression of military leadership preparing to acknowledge a fellow officer. I began moving toward the exit, hoping to evade the approaching confrontation before it could develop into something that would expose years of carefully maintained deception. But the crowd's movement blocked my path as families surged forward to congratulate their graduates, creating a human traffic jam that prevented my escape. I found myself inadvertently pushed toward the area where Tyler stood with my parents, rather than toward the exit I had been targeting. In that moment of navigational confusion, with nowhere to retreat and no way to avoid what was coming, Admiral Wilson reached me. His commanding presence parted the crowd around us like water, and I found myself straightening instinctively, muscle memory responding to the presence of a superior officer despite my civilian clothes and desperate wish to remain invisible. What happened next would permanently alter my family's perception of me and change the course of our relationships forever. Colonel Cross, Admiral Wilson's voice carried clearly above the post-ceremony chatter, the title echoing in the space around us and turning heads throughout our immediate vicinity. I didn't expect to see you here today. My parents, standing just feet away beside Tyler, froze in complete confusion. The word colonel hung in the air like a foreign concept that didn't compute with anything they thought they knew about their daughter. Admiral Wilson, I responded automatically, assuming the formal posture that had been ingrained through years of military service, regardless of my civilian clothes. It's good to see you, sir. Last time was that joint operation in the Gulf, wasn't it? He continued, either unaware of or unconcerned about my family's proximity to our conversation. Your intelligence was impeccable as always, saved a lot of lives that day. My mother's hand flew to her mouth in shock. Tyler's expression transformed from celebration to complete bewilderment, and my father stood rigid with his brow furrowed in deepening confusion. The comfortable reality they had inhabited for over a decade was crumbling in real time. Colonel? My father finally spoke, the word sounding foreign and impossible when directed at me. There must be some mistake here. Admiral Wilson turned, noticing my family for the first time and taking in my father's decorated Marine uniform with the quick assessment of a career military officer. Recognition flashed across his face as he processed the family dynamic he had just disrupted. Colonel Cross, he acknowledged my father with the respect due his rank, before turning back to me with raised eyebrows that conveyed both surprise and understanding. They don't know? Before I could respond or attempt damage control, Commander Brooks approached our growing circle, extending his hand with the professional courtesy of one officer greeting another. Colonel Cross, your team's work on the Antalya operation was remarkable. We've actually implemented your extraction protocols across 3 divisions now. The reality of my position was materializing around us like a photograph developing in solution, becoming clearer and more undeniable with each passing second. My carefully maintained cover, the story of professional mediocrity I had cultivated for years, was dissolving before my eyes. Victoria! My mother's voice trembled with confusion and something approaching shock. What are they talking about? What's happening here? Admiral Wilson assessed the situation with the quick comprehension of a seasoned commander who had navigated delicate situations throughout his career. Colonel Cross, Mrs. Cross, he addressed my parents directly, his tone shifting to something more formal and explanatory. Your daughter is one of our most valuable assets in special operations. Her work in intelligence and counterterrorism has been extraordinary, truly exceptional by any measure. That's not possible, my father stated flatly, his Marine training helping him maintain composure, even as his worldview shifted beneath his feet. Victoria left the Coast Guard Academy. She works in marketing. Air Force, not Coast Guard, Admiral Wilson corrected gently but firmly, and at a rank that reflects exceptional service and achievement. The marketing work would be her cover story, fairly standard protocol in her division. Tyler stepped forward, his new Force Recon insignia gleaming on his uniform as he processed what he was hearing. Vic, is this actually true? The moment of decision had arrived without warning or preparation. Years of carefully maintained secrecy pressed against the sudden, complete exposure of my real life. But as I looked at my family's confused and hurt faces, I recognized that continuing the deception was no longer an option. The truth was out there now, spoken by people whose authority couldn't be questioned or dismissed. Yes, I confirmed simply, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was admitting. It's true. My father's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and the beginning glimmers of reassessment as he tried to reconcile everything he thought he knew about his daughter with this new information. You're actually a colonel in the Air Force? He asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man discovering he had been fundamentally wrong about something important. Special Operations Command, Intelligence Division, I specified, the words feeling strange after years of careful avoidance. I was recruited from the academy directly into a classified program. The dropout story was my required cover. Other officers who recognized me had begun to drift over to our location, creating an impromptu gathering that was making the revelation increasingly public. A major from Joint Special Operations nodded respectfully in my direction and addressed my parents directly. Colonel Cross's analysis changed our entire approach in the Mogadishu intervention, he said with genuine admiration. Her work saved countless lives and prevented what could have been a regional catastrophe. My mother looked physically unsteady, gripping Tyler's arm for support as the implications of what she was hearing began to sink in. All this time, when we thought... she began, but couldn't finish the sentence. I couldn't tell you, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice gentle despite the years of pain and frustration that wanted to pour out. Most of my work is classified at the highest levels. The cover story was a requirement, not a choice I made. Tyler's expression had transformed completely, shifting from confusion to a growing understanding that only another military professional could fully grasp. The pieces were falling into place for him faster than for our parents. That's why you missed my engagement party, he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of dawning comprehension. I was coordinating an extraction of exposed assets in Eastern Europe, I confirmed, finally able to speak truthfully about my absence. It couldn't wait, and I couldn't explain what was really happening. My father, drawing on his decades of military experience, had regained his composure and was processing this information with characteristic precision. "What's your security clearance level?" he asked, the question coming from the career officer rather than the disappointed parent. "Higher than I can specify in this setting," I answered carefully, the response itself confirming more than the actual words could convey. Around us, the crowd continued to celebrate, largely oblivious to the family drama unfolding in our small circle. But within that circle, years of misperception and disappointment were crumbling under the weight of revealed truth. Admiral Wilson, sensing the deeply personal nature of the moment developing around us, prepared to withdraw tactfully. "Colonel Cross," he addressed my father with military courtesy, "you should be incredibly proud. Your daughter's service record is exceptional by any standard. The details are classified, but I can tell you that the value of her contributions is beyond question." He turned to me with a respectful nod that acknowledged both my rank and the delicate family situation he had inadvertently created. "Colonel, I'll see you at next month's Joint Operations Briefing. Take care." As he departed, the protective barrier between my two worlds, the accomplished military officer and the family disappointment, had been irrevocably breached. Standing before my family in civilian clothes but now recognized as Colonel Cross, I felt exposed in a way that countless high-risk operations had never made me feel. The vulnerability was complete and unfamiliar. In operational environments, I had control, training, and clear objectives. Here, facing my family's shocked faces, I had nothing but years of accumulated hurt and the hope that truth might create possibilities that deception had destroyed. "Why would you let us believe you'd failed?" my mother asked, hurt evident in both her voice and expression. The question carried the weight of a decade of disappointment and misplaced concern. "It wasn't about what you believed," I explained carefully, choosing my words with the same precision I applied to intelligence briefings. "It was about operational security. The fewer people who knew my real position, the safer the operations became, and the safer the people involved in those operations remained." My father, processing this revelation with his decades of military experience, was beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been hidden from them. "To reach colonel at your age in special operations," he trailed off, the implications clear to someone who understood military career progression. Tyler, with his own developing military expertise, was connecting dots faster than anyone else. Those unexplained absences, the vague explanations about work, that time you showed up at Christmas with what looked like shrapnel wounds that you claimed were from a car accident. "Not a car accident," I confirmed quietly, finally able to acknowledge the truth about injuries that had required careful lies to explain. As reality settled around us, I watched my family recalibrating years of perceptions and judgments in real time. The disappointment they had carried about me, and the disappointment I had endured from them, was transforming into something else entirely. Something yet undefined, but irrevocably changed by the truth. "We have a lot to talk about," my father said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man discovering he had been fundamentally wrong about something he thought he understood completely. "Yes," I agreed simply, "we do." The family dinner following Tyler's ceremony took place at an upscale restaurant near the base. A celebration that had been planned long before the day's revelations completely altered our family dynamic. What should have been exclusively focused on Tyler's achievement had now become something else entirely, the first honest family gathering of my adult life. We were seated at a private table in the corner, my security consciousness automatically appreciating the discretion even in this new context. My father ordered wine with uncharacteristic generosity, perhaps recognizing that this conversation would require some social lubrication to navigate successfully. Silence hung heavily as menus were studied with unusual intensity, everyone avoiding the enormous elephant that now occupied the room with us. The weight of years of misunderstanding and the magnitude of what had been revealed created an atmosphere that felt both charged and fragile. Finally, the waiter departed with our orders, and my father set his water glass down with characteristic precision. "So," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "a colonel." It wasn't a question, but I nodded confirmation anyway. The simple acknowledgement felt monumental after years of hiding my real accomplishments. "That's remarkably fast advancement," he continued, the career military officer in him automatically calculating the timeline and implications. "Especially for someone in," he lowered his voice instinctively, "special operations." "It was a unique path," I acknowledged carefully. "The program I was recruited into accelerates promotion timelines based on field performance rather than standard timing requirements." My mother, who had been unusually quiet throughout the exchange, finally found her voice. "All those times we thought you were being flaky or irresponsible, disappearing from family events, being unreachable for days at a time. I was deployed," I finished for her, the simple truth finally spoken aloud. "Often in locations I can't name, doing things I still can't discuss in detail." Tyler leaned forward, professional curiosity mixing with brotherly reassessment. "That scar on your shoulder from 2 Christmases ago?" "Somalia," I said simply, offering the truth without elaboration. "Extraction operation went sideways." My father's face tightened with understanding. The career Marine officer grasped immediately what "went sideways" typically meant in special operations contexts, and the implications for the daughter he thought he knew. "And we were giving you grief about missing family photos," my mother whispered, horror dawning in her expression as she processed the reality of what had been happening while they focused on trivial concerns. The conversation paused as our salads arrived, providing a brief respite from the intensity of these revelations. When the waiter departed again, my father asked the question that clearly bothered him most on a professional level. "Why the Air Force? You were at the Coast Guard Academy." I had to smile slightly at his priorities. Of course, that would be his first substantive question, the branch loyalty that defined his identity. "The program that recruited me operated jointly across services," I explained. "But it was administratively housed under Air Force Special Operations Command. The work suited my particular skills regardless of which branch uniform I wore." "Which are?" he pressed, his curiosity now professional rather than paternal. "Intelligence analysis under high-pressure conditions, pattern recognition in asymmetric environments, asset development, and management in hostile territories." I paused, considering how much I could safely share. "Some other specialties I can't detail." Tyler whistled softly, recognition clear in his expression. "That's the heavy stuff, Vic. The kind of work that changes the course of entire operations." My mother was struggling to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with this new reality that challenged everything she had believed for over a decade. "But why couldn't you tell us anything? We're your family." "Operational security," I explained gently, trying to help her understand without revealing classified details. "The nature of my work means that knowledge of my real position could potentially endanger operations or expose networks of people whose lives depend on secrecy." "The cover story was created and maintained by the program, not by my choice," I continued. "It wasn't personal. It was professional necessity." "For 12 years?" my father challenged, the hurt beneath his question evident despite his military bearing and attempt to maintain composure. "Not one word of truth?" The pain in his voice was unmistakable, cutting through his practiced discipline. "That's the job, Dad," I said simply, meeting his eyes directly. "You of all people should understand that some positions require complete compartmentalization. Some duties demand personal sacrifices that others can't see or appreciate." He fell silent, his military discipline acknowledging what the father in him wanted to deny. The concept of duty above personal comfort was something he understood fundamentally, even when it applied to his own daughter in ways he hadn't anticipated. The main course arrived, providing another brief reprieve from the intensity of our conversation. As we began eating, Tyler broke the tension with a short laugh that contained more amazement than humor. "So all those times I was bragging about my promotions and assignments, telling you about my training and accomplishments, you were talking to someone who was briefing Joint Chiefs and coordinating international operations," I finished with a small smile, the irony finally something we could acknowledge openly. "God, I must have sounded like such an idiot," he groaned, genuine embarrassment coloring his voice. "You didn't," I assured him firmly. "Your accomplishments are real and significant. We work in different operational areas with different challenges. There's no comparison to be made, just different paths serving the same ultimate purpose." My mother set down her fork, her food barely touched throughout the meal. I keep thinking about all the things we said to you over the years, the disappointment we expressed, the judgments we made. Her voice was thick with regret and growing understanding. The way we wrote you off as someone who couldn't live up to family expectations. You didn't know, I said, trying to ease the guilt I could see building in her expression. You couldn't have known. The cover story was designed specifically to be believable and discourage deeper investigation. But we should have trusted you, she insisted, tears gathering in her eyes. We should have seen that there was more happening than what appeared on the surface. Instead, we just accepted the worst possible interpretation and treated you accordingly. The raw truth of her statement hung in the air around our table. They had written me off, creating a narrative of family disappointment that fit the limited information they possessed, never questioning whether there might be more to the story. My father, always less comfortable with emotional displays, redirected the conversation slightly toward more familiar ground. Admiral Wilson mentioned an upcoming promotion. Are you being considered for Brigadier General? I confirmed quietly. It's not finalized yet, but yes. His eyebrows rose sharply, professional recognition overriding parental surprise. At your age, that would be unprecedented in special operations. The recommendation is based on the results of the Tavos operation, I said, offering what little I could share. That's all I can say about the specifics. My mother wiped her eyes with her napkin, struggling to process the magnitude of achievements she was learning about. And we wouldn't have known about this either if today hadn't happened by accident. I hesitated, then decided on complete honesty within the bounds of what I could share. Probably not the details. Eventually, you might have learned that I was military, but specifics about rank and position would likely have remained classified indefinitely. The meal continued with a mixture of questions I could answer intermingled with ones I couldn't, creating an imperfect but vastly improved form of communication. The boundaries of classified information remained firmly in place even in this new openness. But for the first time, my family was seeing the outline of my real life, even if many crucial details remained in shadow. After dinner, my parents invited me back to their home, a gesture that felt significant after years of emotional distance and strained interactions. The invitation itself represented a desire to rebuild something that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding. In their living room, my mother disappeared briefly before returning with a dusty box that she set carefully between us on the coffee table. I kept these, she said, her voice soft with emotion, even though I didn't understand why you'd want them anymore. Inside the box were mementos from my academy days that should have been meaningless to preserve for someone who had supposedly failed out. My cadet's cap, academic awards, photographs from formal events, items that would have made no logical sense to keep for a daughter who had washed out of military service. Yet she had kept them all anyway, carefully stored and preserved through years of supposed disappointment. Some part of me never believed the story completely, she admitted quietly, running her fingers over one of my academic achievement certificates. It didn't fit the daughter I had raised, the person I knew you were capable of being. But I couldn't imagine an alternative explanation that made sense. My father, after several drinks and hours of processing these revelations, had grown unusually reflective in a way that was rare for him. Military directness was his usual approach to difficult conversations, but tonight called for something different. I was hardest on you, he acknowledged, applying his characteristic honesty to his own failings. When we thought you'd washed out, I took it personally. I made it about my legacy and reputation rather than trying to understand your path. I understood why you reacted that way, I told him honestly. And maintaining the cover story was part of my duty, even when it was incredibly difficult to bear your disappointment. The concept resonated deeply with his Marine Corps values. At the expense of being known by your own family, he said, the full weight of the sacrifice beginning to dawn on him. Tyler, who had been listening quietly throughout most of this exchange, finally spoke again. But things can be different now, right? I mean, we know the basic truth even if specific details have to stay classified. It was the question I had been considering throughout the evening, trying to balance hope with realistic expectations about what could actually change. Some things can definitely change, I agreed cautiously. You know my actual profession now, my general position and rank. That's a foundation we didn't have before. But most of my work will still remain classified, I continued, wanting to set realistic expectations. There will still be unexplained absences, questions I can't answer, missions I can't discuss. But we'll understand what they mean now, my mother said, grasping the crucial difference. We'll know that your silence means something important, not that you don't care about us. As the evening drew to a close, my father did something unprecedented in our relationship. He stood and straightened as if addressing a fellow officer, then extended his hand with formal military courtesy. "Colonel Cross," he said, using my rank for the first time in his life, "I believe I owe you both an apology and my respect." I took his hand, years of military bearing preventing the emotion building in my throat from showing on my face. "Thank you, Colonel," I replied, matching his formality with the respect due his own distinguished service. It was an imperfect beginning to a new chapter in our relationship, one where the truth, even though necessarily incomplete, had created genuine possibilities for healing what deception had damaged over the years. As I left my parents' home that night, I carried both the continued weight of necessary secrets that would never fully disappear, and the newfound lightness of being partially known by the people who mattered most to me. The burden hadn't disappeared, but it had been shared in the only way my position allowed. 6 months after Tyler's force recon ceremony, I found myself approaching my parents' home for another family gathering, this time for a 4th of July barbecue that had been a cross-family tradition for decades. The familiar nervousness that had accompanied these visits for years had transformed into something completely different. A cautious optimism about family relationships that were rebuilding themselves on more honest ground. As I walked up the driveway carrying a dish I had actually prepared myself rather than the usual hastily purchased store contribution, I noticed several of my father's old Marine colleagues gathered around the grill. In previous years, I had avoided these military-heavy gatherings whenever possible, finding the deception particularly difficult among people who spoke my professional language fluently. Today felt different in every possible way. My father spotted me approaching and straightened slightly, not quite assuming the formal attention stance of military protocol, but displaying a new recognition that carried its own significance and respect. "Vic's here," he called out, using my familiar name but with a tone I hadn't heard in over a decade. As I approached the group, he did something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. He turned to his friends with unmistakable pride and said, "Gentlemen, my daughter Colonel Cross, Air Force Special Operations." The introduction was simple but completely accurate, representing a seismic shift in how he presented me to his peers. The retired officers nodded with the immediate respect of men who understood precisely what the rank and division signified, particularly for someone my age. No details were necessary or appropriate. The basic facts communicated volumes to those who spoke the language of military service and understood the significance of achieving colonel rank in special operations at my age. My mother emerged from the house, her greeting noticeably warmer than I could remember experiencing in years. As she hugged me, she whispered conspiratorially, "I put together a small display in the study. Nothing classified, I promise." Curious about what she meant, I followed her inside to my father's traditional domain, the study that had always been filled exclusively with his Marine memorabilia and achievements. In one corner, she had created a discreet but meaningful arrangement that took my breath away. The display included my academy graduation photo, the few unclassified commendations I had been able to share with them, and a recent formal photograph in uniform following my promotion to Brigadier General. It was tasteful, respectful, and completely appropriate from a security standpoint. "Is this okay?" she asked, uncertainty evident in her voice. "I wanted to honor your service alongside your father's, but I wasn't sure about security concerns or whether it was appropriate." I examined the display carefully, checking for anything that might compromise operational security. "It's perfect," I assured her, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Nothing here reveals operational details or classified information." Her relief was immediately evident. "Good. Your father checks it every day, you know. I think he's still wrapping his mind around everything we learned." Returning to the backyard, I found Tyler manning the grill alongside our father, a scene that represented the kind of normal family interaction that had been missing from our gatherings for years. My brother's transformation had been perhaps the most straightforward of anyone's. One military professional recognizing another, with the shared understanding that comes from parallel experiences despite different branches and specializations. "General," he greeted me with a grin, and a deliberately informal salute that managed to be both respectful and affectionately teasing. "Burger or hot dog?" "Both," I replied, falling easily into the sibling banter that had been absent for far too long. "I just finished 3 weeks of MREs, so I'm making up for lost time." He nodded with immediate understanding of what 3 weeks in the field likely signified. Without asking questions he knew I couldn't answer. This new shorthand between us, acknowledging the boundaries of classified work without resentment or curiosity, had become one of the unexpected gifts of finally living with partial truth. The afternoon progressed with a lightness I hadn't experienced at family gatherings in over a decade. Though many topics remained necessarily off-limits, my recent deployment locations, the specific nature of current operations, the details of upcoming assignments, the fundamental truth of who I was and what I did now formed the solid foundation of our interactions. My father, always more comfortable expressing himself through actions than words, found numerous ways to demonstrate his changed perspective throughout the day. He introduced me to his colleagues with unmistakable pride, referenced my operational insight when discussions turned to current military affairs, and most tellingly, he deferred to my expertise in areas where Air Force operations intersected with Marine concerns. This professional respect meant more to me than any verbal apology could have. It represented a fundamental shift in how he saw me, not as the family disappointment, but as a fellow military professional whose achievements deserved recognition and whose opinions carried weight. As evening approached and we gathered for the traditional cross-family photo that marked every 4th of July celebration, I stood beside Tyler with both of us now recognized for our service rather than compared by it. The dynamic had shifted from competition to mutual respect. My mother arranged us with the precision of a longtime military spouse who had orchestrated countless family photos over the years. "My children," she said proudly to a neighbor who was taking the photograph, "both serving their country, just in different ways." The simple statement acknowledged the parallel value of our different paths, a recognition that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. We were no longer the successful son and the disappointing daughter, but two military professionals who had chosen different branches and specializations. Later, as fireworks illuminated the sky in patriotic celebration, my father joined me at the edge of the yard, where I had stepped away briefly to check a secure message on my phone. These operational communications were now understood as part of my reality rather than evidence of my disengagement from family. "All good?" he asked, the question encompassing more than just the immediate communication. He was asking about my work, my well-being, and our relationship. "Yes," I confirmed, returning the phone to my pocket with practiced discretion. "Nothing urgent." He nodded, gazing upward at the fireworks display rather than at me, employing a military man's approach to emotional conversation that made difficult topics more manageable. "I've been thinking about what it cost you," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of months of reflection. "Carrying that cover story all these years, bearing our disappointment when you were actually doing." "My job," I finished when he trailed off, not wanting him to struggle with words that were difficult for both of us. "That's all it was, Dad. The job I was assigned with the parameters that were required." "But the personal cost," he insisted, still watching the fireworks rather than looking at me. "Missing the recognition you deserved, even from your own family. The isolation that must have created." I considered this observation, formulating my response with the same care I applied to operational assessments. "There's something freeing about being evaluated solely on your work," I offered thoughtfully, without external expectations or family legacy influencing perceptions. In some ways, starting with a blank slate allowed me to define my own path completely. He absorbed this perspective in thoughtful silence, processing the idea that what he had seen as punishment might have contained unexpected benefits. "Still, I regret the judgments we made with incomplete information," he said, applying military honesty to his own failures. "The assumptions we drew without considering alternative explanations." "That's the nature of intelligence work," I replied, with a small smile, finding a way to apply professional principles to personal relationships. Everyone operates with incomplete information. The difference is whether you recognize its incompleteness and remain open to revision. This observation, drawing parallels between operational methodology and family dynamics, seemed to resonate with him in a way that pure emotion might not have. "A fair assessment," he acknowledged, his nod carrying the precision of military approval. As we rejoined the family gathering, I reflected on the strange and meaningful journey of the past 6 months. The revelation at Tyler's ceremony had not instantly repaired years of misunderstanding and hurt feelings, but it had created space for something entirely new to grow between us. The family that had once seen me as their greatest disappointment was now navigating a recalibrated relationship based on partial truth, the maximum disclosure my position would ever allow. It wasn't perfect transparency, but it was genuine connection, built on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. 2 weeks later, I stood at attention during my promotion ceremony, as the stars of a brigadier general were affixed to my uniform. The significance of the moment was overwhelming. Becoming one of the youngest people in history to achieve this rank in special operations represented the culmination of years of dedicated service and exceptional performance. Unlike my previous promotions that had been celebrated only among cleared colleagues in classified ceremonies, this one included 3 seats in the family section, occupied by my parents and brother. Their presence transformed what could have been another lonely professional milestone into something that felt genuinely meaningful. The technical details of my accomplishments remained necessarily classified in the official citation, cloaked in the deliberately vague language that Special Operations uses to acknowledge achievement without revealing operational specifics. But the pride in my family's eyes needed no detailed explanation or elaboration. They understood enough now, not everything, but enough to appreciate the significance of what was happening. The rank itself spoke volumes about the level of responsibility and trust I had earned through my service. As the ceremony concluded and I joined my family afterward, my mother embraced me with tears streaming down her face. "I always knew you were exceptional," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion and regret. "I just didn't know how." My father, maintaining his characteristic Marine bearing even in this emotional moment, extended his hand for a formal shake before professional composure gave way to parental pride, and he pulled me into a brief, tight hug. "Well done, General Cross," he said gruffly, his voice carrying both military respect and fatherly affection. "Well done." The journey from family disappointment to recognized professional had been complicated by necessary secrets and security requirements that would never fully disappear from my life. But standing with my family and accepting congratulations for an achievement they could finally acknowledge, I found a sense of peace in being partially known. It was an imperfect visibility after years of operating in complete shadows, but it represented meaningful progress toward authenticity within the constraints of my chosen profession. For anyone reading this who has ever been misjudged or underestimated based on limited information, there's a powerful lesson in this experience. Sometimes the truth emerges in unexpected ways, often when we least expect it and in circumstances we couldn't have planned. The perceptions others hold about us aren't always reflections of reality. They're often simply products of incomplete information and assumptions made in the absence of facts. The worth you create through your work and choices remains valid and meaningful, even when it goes unrecognized by those around you. Authenticity, even when necessarily incomplete due to professional or personal constraints, creates possibilities for genuine connection that deception can never achieve. The relationships built on partial truth proved more satisfying than those maintained through complete fiction. The most powerful truths are sometimes the ones we carry quietly within us until the right moment for revelation arrives, often in ways we never could have anticipated or planned. Have you ever been misjudged based on appearances or assumptions? Have you ever had to keep important parts of yourself hidden for necessary reasons, whether professional, personal, or family-related? I'd love to hear your stories and experiences in the comments below. If this journey of family reconciliation and professional recognition resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience, unexpected revelation, and the complex relationships between duty and family. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the most meaningful recognition comes not from strangers, but from the people closest to us finally understanding who we really are.